Hello, glad you could join me. Today we're going to be starting making this Viking Longship, and I'm going to start by making the keel. So I have been doing quite a bit of research into these ships, these dragon ships as they are called in the sagas. So I do want to try and create something that is historically accurate or influenced by these historical Viking dragon ships, as obviously I'm making it out of steel, not wood, so it's not going to be exactly the same as they were, but I want it to be as accurate as I can make it out of steel, if that makes sense. As I said, we're going to be making the keel, so let's get started. So for the keel, we're going to be making a piece of steel into a T-section. I've seen sort of two types of keel. This is the one that I've seen more of, and the one that sort of makes more sense to me. The keel is sort of the main trunk of the ship, which actually supposedly the Vikings invented this idea of putting a main trunk in the ship, which then on our piece of steel it's going to come up into the head on one end and the tail on the other. So this is the main piece of steel, which then has all of our boards riveted on. So that's the bottom, this is the top, and the boards get riveted on there, forming our boat. So this is the keel that I've seen more of, so more examples of, and so this is the one that we're going to make. I've also seen keels which look like this, and so the boards then get riveted on there. However, I think this one I've only seen sort of in one example, so I'm going to go with this T section, which I think is more historically accurate. The Vikings would, of course, have made this out of one piece of wood for the main bottom, and then the top section where the head is and where the tail are, they are then made out of two different pieces of wood and then glued and riveted onto this main keel. However, I'm going to make this out of two pieces of steel, so there's going to be the main bottom piece and then another piece which gets riveted on. I think that's going to be the easiest way to make it out of steel, just because trying to forge a T section is a little bit tricky. You can do it, you know, you'll have to create a hardy block and then a top fuller to section in this material, then flatten down that material there. So there's a bit of work in it if you want to forge it out of one piece. So I'm just going to do it that piece and then another piece which gets riveted on. So I want to be using traditional methods to put all of this ship together, so riveting these parts rather than welding, as this is, you know, these ships were actually riveted together. They're called clinker-built ships, which for a blacksmith at first sounds a little odd, clinker, you know, being something that we take out the fire, but clinker-built ships refers to the sound made of riveting the rivets over. So it goes, you know, clink, 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 which is then clinker-built ships. And so the boards that we put on get overlapped and then a rivet goes through. They would also glue them with a pitch, you know, a pine resin glue, to make sure that they are really secure on there. But yes, they were clinker-built ships riveted together. So I've got a piece of 16mm square bar, which is what I'm going to use to forge out the bottom section. And so I need to flatten it a bit to get a rectangle first, and then we can think about putting the shape in it. And I think I'll forge the head, the serpent's head or dragon's head on the end first, put that bend in, and then forge out the tail and get that set as well. I want to give a bit of historical context to these ships, as I was interested in, you know, learning about these Viking ships, as it's sort of something, you know, I live in England here, so we were obviously raided by the Vikings at some point during history, and I wanted to learn about this just for myself, but also to then do the research to try and make one of these longships and forge out something that vaguely resembles a historically accurate ship. The time of the Viking dragon ship, as it is called in the sagas, was the late 10th to the late 11th century. The sagas say that these ships were huge ships that would be manned by at least 100 men, maybe even 200. So you can really get a scale of just how big they are. And they would be the leading ship in a fleet. So often the king's ship, as the king would be the only one who would be able to get the money to actually buy and make the ship. So it's disputed whether Harold Finehair had a dragon ship. He was much earlier than the sort of the time period, which is late 10th to late 11th. So he was the sort of end of the 9th century. So he was much earlier. He was the first king of Norway. It is disputed whether he did have a dragon ship. However, they say that it's probably much later on, as the sagas say. However, again, with the sagas were written maybe 100 years after the time of the dragon ships, as the dragon ships were during the Dark Ages, where there wasn't much historical sources being written, or if they were being written, they were then lost. And so we don't have many accurate sources from the time. And so all the sagas are written after, based off oral traditions of passing down these stories. And so they can then be exaggerated, and the size of these ships can then be exaggerated. So if they are being exaggerated, we have to then go on to the archaeology of the time, and we can look at the ships that we've managed to find in the ground and study those. So in 1957, there were the 5 ships at Roskilde called the Skulldelev ships, and these were sunken during sort of, I think, early 11th century, so during our time of these dragon ships. However, these aren't really dragon ships. They were just sort of trading ships, or even maybe they were battleships, but they were sunk as a defence against an oncoming fleet. And so these were preserved pretty well, and so we can see the structure of these ships and how they were built. There was one there that I think was 30 metres long. So that's a decent sized ship. However, the dragon ships were more like 40 metres long, so they're much bigger. In 1997, they then discovered another ship buried near Roskilde, so where the Skulldelev ships were found, and this ship was 37 metres long. So this is a dragon ship now. You know, this is sort of that size of ship that would have to be manned by at least 100 men to actually move it through the water. And so that is interesting that there is then the archaeological evidence to back up the sagas, which we thought were sort of exaggerated, and then you've actually found this ship buried in the ground, which is, you know, the size talked about in the sagas. Or maybe this would be a small dragon ship compared to the sagas, but it's still a hefty size compared with other ships like the other Skulldelev ships from the time period. This one dwarfs those. You know, this is huge. Talking about the dragon ships, it's not always dragons' heads on the front of the ships, which I didn't realise this. I always thought that, you know, I actually thought that it was a sea serpent's head on the ship. However, the sagas and things consistently call them dragon ships, and so that's obviously what it is, a dragon's head at the front and a tail at the other end. However, it wasn't always the case. There were some ships, like there was one that I was reading about which had Thor's head on the front, and that was then changed to a cross. And so that was, you know, a very religious sort of thing to have on your ship. So Thor's head, which obviously then the owner converted to Christianity, and so it was then a cross at the front of the ship. There was another one which was a bull's head at the front, and that was then plated in gold. So there seems to be a whole variety of different figureheads that they were put on the front of the ships. However, the dragon is the most common. And I was looking at the design of the heads, or the figureheads on these ships, and I thought they were much more wolf-like in their design. They had ears rather than horns, which is generally sort of where, in my animal heads, I'll always do a dragon with horns, and if I do a wolf, I'll do it with ears. And so to me, they're much more like wolves, but they're obviously called dragon ships, and so that's what we're going to call it. And when you think of a Viking ship, you always think of the dragon's head on the front, but that, again, wasn't always the case. A lot of these ships didn't have dragon's heads on the front, as only the wealthy, the kings, could afford to get that piece carved and put on the front of their ship. However, it is, you know, a lot of the Viking ships did have them, and again, there is that archaeological evidence of these ships having these figureheads on. Another interesting thing that I learned was that the descendants of Ivar the Boneless, so he was a Norse king, his descendants raided the northwest of England, which is where I am. So about 1,000 years ago, those Vikings would have been raiding the Anglo-Saxons that lived where I live, which I thought was quite interesting, as I've always thought of the Vikings of raiding the east of England and sort of East Anglia and Wessex, and then obviously you do have York, but York's a bit sort of more towards the middle of England. And I never really thought about the Vikings raiding the west. And then doing a bit more research, they also raided much of Ireland and sort of all over. But I've always thought of them raiding the east side of England, as it's obviously closer to Norway. They just have to come across the North Sea and then they're there on the east side of England. Right, I think that's enough historical context for now. Let's get back to forging. So I've got this material knocked down to a nice rectangular bar, which is the profile that we want. And I've also upset the end. So the end is a bit thicker, as this material here is what I'm going to use to forge into this dragon's head. So this isn't going to be like the other animal heads that I've made before in the way that I make it. Usually those animal heads, to get the volume, I'll create bends in the material. However, with this, I've upset it so that we have more mass in the end. So hopefully we can now just forge the head out of this solid bar. So I'm going to come over the far edge, create an isolation, and that's going to be for the back of the jaw. That's the basic preform of our head. We've got two little spots there for some nostrils on the end, and then we can cut a mouth in. And then the eyes, if you look at a lot of sort of Viking figureheads, the eyes tend to be at the side or on an angle, and I think I'm going to put them almost on the 45 degrees, so on an angle, rather than being straight on the front of the face, which is how I would usually do a dragon head. We're going to just come on the side. Okay, nostrils first. Now really flare them out with a wider or steeper point on the centre punch. So I'll mark the mouth out so you can feel it when it's hot. So now I'm going in with a nice big eye tool. I'm just going to mark it again so I can then feel it when we're hot. So let's get the mouth in. You'll see, because of the way that we've clamped this in the vise, which is sort of the way that I'm going to have to do this to put this mouth in, it's pushed this snout down as we've been cutting this line in, so the face has been pushed down quite a lot. However, if you look at it, I sort of quite like it in a way, and I think it does look sort of more like the figureheads actually look like. The snout, it's this bottom jaw tends to be quite pushed down and with a bit of a lip on it like we've got there. So I don't think it's such a bad thing. It wasn't really what I was aiming for, but I do think it works in a way. I'm going to try and forge the eye in on the anvil, as we've got that same problem of clamping it in the vise here, and if we're then hammering at the side, we're just going to bend it. You can see I've done that eye, and I managed to do that on the anvil, so hopefully we can put the other one in without messing up the eye that I've already forged, which is going to be on the face of the anvil. We've got the eyes done and all the rest of the facial features. What I want to do now is put the ears on. And so I was thinking between sort of two ways of doing this. One being we use a chisel to cut into this material and sort of bend the ears out there. Or the second way, which is what I'm going to do, is weld 2 pieces of sort of 6mm round onto this bar and then forge the ears out of those. And that's how I've done it before on sort of like my the horse's head. That was what I did. Just weld 2 little rods of 6mm round on and then forge the ears out of that. So it's not going to be the most traditional method, but I think it's going to be the best way to get the ears on there rather than trying to cut into this material. We've got those 2 pieces welded on, so we can now flatten those to form the ears, then take a grinder, sort of point them, profile those shapes, and then I'm going to try and dish them slightly to put a bit more shape into the ears rather than them being completely flat. I'm going to take some rasps and files to get these ears to sort of a point on the end, so much more triangular end rather than being sort of a half circle, just to refine them so they're a bit more pointy, and then we can put the shape, sort of a dish, into each of them. So I'm going to come in on this tool which we actually used for the fin of the sea serpent. So I can use this, hopefully, to put a bit of a cut onto the ears. So you can do this in the step of the anvil, but I think it'll be a bit easier doing it in this hardy block. I'll just bend these into a place that I think they look natural, how ears would actually be, even though this is supposed to be a dragon. It's looking a bit more wolf-like than dragon-like, but that was what I thought when I was looking at the historical ones anyway. They look much more like a wolf, I thought, than a dragon. So I'm going to dot the pupils on the eyes, and I'm going to do it sort of at the 45, I think, because most of the time you're going to see the face from the side, which is why we've done the eyeballs more towards the side. I think that's more historically accurate as well when you look at them. A lot of them have the eyes much more on the side of the face. Now we can put the bend into the piece. Of course, when this is made of wood, this would be made of 2 different pieces. They wouldn't try and bend a piece of wood to this tight radius. We've got the prow all bent up with our head there on the end. I've cut it to length, so we can now forge the tail out on this end. We've got the taper all forged out. I want to put a scroll on the end, and looking at some of these older Viking longships, the scroll tends to be really tight. Just a really quite small scroll, but really tight. And sometimes they'll put like leaves on it or do a little whiplash. So I think I'm going to go for a whiplash on the end. So just bending the end of the scroll the opposite way to the curve. And it adds a little different aesthetic to the scroll. And now I want to bend the end out, but I'm going to leave that until we've got the scroll coming around, and then do it with a pair of scrolling pliers. Now I'll bend the end. Just flick it out. Now put the bend into this back end of the ship, or the keel. That's the shape of the keel all forged out. I've now been working on this piece, which is going to be the piece that's going to get riveted in to form our T-section. And you'll see I'll put a taper on this end. I'm going to do the same to the other. I've got to cut it off and then draw a taper down, and that's so it fades away into the keel. So as we're putting these boards on, the T-section doesn't get in the way, and also you can't see it when you're looking. You know, it's not the T-section doesn't need to be here. We don't need it there. We just need it on the bottom so we can then rivet the planks on there. So I've got to cut a bit off this bar and then draw down a taper just like this one. So I've got this piece forged out. It's going to sit on the centre there. May need a bit of bending just to match the beginning of this curve here. So I'll mark out all the holes, get them drilled, and then we can rivet it on. So I've got my 5 holes drilled here into this sort of top section, and then in the actual keel, the underside, I've only got the middle hole drilled. I'm going to be using a piece of 4mm bar for the rivets, and I'm actually going to use 4mm bar for all of the rivets on the ship, and that's because I find that I can do this cold with 4mm round bar, whereas sort of any larger bar, I find that I've got to do it hot, as if I don't do it hot, we'll get stress fractures. However, with 4mm, I find that it's okay. So I'll get this one set and then drill the holes for these, get those riveted, and that'll be the keel done. That's the first of many rivets that are going to be on this ship, as all of the planks are going to be riveted together. So I don't know how many there are going to be. I think I should count them up once we finish the entire thing, but there's going to be a lot of rivets in this. I'm going to drill the holes and rivet them one at a time, so I've only just drilled this hole at the moment. That one's going to be a little bit tricky to drill, as I can't actually get it in the drill press, so it may be drilled at sort of a funny angle so I can actually drill the hole, but it'll be fine to rivet that up. But I'll do them one at a time, gradually moving the clamp down, and it shouldn't take too long. So there we are, all riveted together. So we've made some good progress today starting this Viking Longship. We've got the keel sort of all finished up and ready now for us, hopefully in the next video, to put all of these boards on, overlapping boards, onto the ship, so it actually begins to look much more like a ship. So thank you for watching the video. Hopefully you're going to stick around and watch me finish making this Viking Longship. It's probably going to be a couple more parts, hopefully shorter length parts. I realise that I'm going to have quite a lot of footage here, so this is probably going to be a bit of a longer episode compared with the other ones. I'm going to try and keep the time down. I don't know if that's sort of a good thing, but I think to try and create some shorter videos, but there's going to be more of them, if that makes sense. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.